Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today, folks, really deep into the Old Testament sanctuary.
Oh, yeah, this is gonna be good.
We're talking design. We're talking symbolism. We're talking about those high priest
The
vestments.
threads, the bling, the meaning.
We're using an online Bible study on Exodus as our source today.
Classic. Always a good starting point.
So get this. We're going to uncover hidden meanings behind, like, the most basic stuff.
Okay, I'm listening.
Like, why did they build the sanctuary facing east?
Good question.
And the number 8. It's everywhere. What's the deal with that?
8. Okay, now you've got me intrigued.
And bells on robes to avoid death.
Wait, what? Bells?
Seriously, it's all connected. Let's kick things off with the altar of burnt offerings. Our source says it's acacia wood covered in bronze. Very specific.
Oh, absolutely. Every detail matters here. It wasn't just random, right?
So why those materials?
Well, bronze was for the courtyard, but they used more precious metals the further in you went.
Oh, interesting.
It's like visually, the closer you get to the divine, the more sacred the space. Makes you think, huh?
It does. So the materials themselves tell a story.
Exactly. And speaking of stories, let's talk about those horns on the altar.
Horns. Okay, now I'm
Yep.
picturing something completely different.
No, actual horns. And they weren't just there to look cool.
Have all ears. What were they for?
Okay, so get this. They were part of the blood sacrifice ritual, but also
Yes.
a place to plead for mercy.
Whoa. That's intense.
Same structure, two completely opposite ideas, sacrifice and refuge.
Wow. Powerful imagery. Makes you wonder if, I don't know, have you ever noticed this kind of thing in other religions?
Oh, for sure. It's all connected. But let's move on, shall we? To the courtyard.
The sanctuary courtyard. It had these linen curtains hung on bronze sockets and silver rods, like a defined space for worship.
Oh, yeah. The boundaries are important. Sacred versus mundane, you know?
Yeah.
You need that separation. A place to meet the divine. A room where it happens.
Love it. But okay, our source mentions a debate about the pillars in the courtyard.
Ah, yes. The pillar debate. A classic.
Some say 56, others 60, and get this, it says some details might have been left out of the description because Moses, he saw the actual blueprint on Mount Sinai.
Imagine that. The lost architectural plans.
Right. I'd love to see those. Anyway, the source also says the entrance faced east and the Ark of the Covenant, way over in the west. Was that on purpose?
Oh, yeah, big time. Entering from the east meant moving towards God. Exiting, well, that was moving away, like,
Yeah.
The fall of man, driven out of Eden, all that.
So the layout itself, it's telling the story of our relationship with God.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Okay, let's move on to the tabernacle itself. The source mentions it was way taller than the courtyard walls, like twice as high. What's up with that?
Oh, that was intentional, too. It was a visual thing. God's dwelling place had to be visible, even from outside the courtyard.
So people could see it, but not actually get in unless...
Unless they were part of the covenant. Exactly.
Right.
It was like, hey, God's here,
Yeah.
but you got to be in the club to get close.
Wow. It's a powerful visual, right? Like a reminder that access to God, it's not a given.
Precisely.
Okay, let's get to the fun part. The priestly vestments. The high priest had like 8 pieces of clothing, each with a meaning.
And that number 8, super significant.
Really? Why 8?
Think about it. Redemption, salvation, rebirth. It's all there. The high priest was like walking, talking, a redeemed man.
I never thought about it like that. But I gotta say, those vestments were pretty fancy. Gold, jewels, fine linen. Didn't it seem a little, I don't know, much?
Well, the source quotes Exodus here. It says the purpose was to give the high priest, quote, dignity and magnificence.
Dignity and magnificence.
Exactly. They wanted to create a sense of awe to reflect the glory of God.
Makes sense. It wasn't just about being flashy. It was about, like, setting the stage for a powerful encounter with the divine.
You got it.
Okay, let's focus on 2 pieces here. The ephod and the breastplate of judgment. Both had those stones engraved with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Ah, yes. But the placement is key.
Okay, tell me more.
The names on the shoulders. That's the high priest bearing the burden of the people before God, and the breastplate right over the heart,
Yeah.
bearing their judgment. He was a mediator, you see, between the people and God.
Powerful stuff. Makes you think, are there modern equivalents to this? I mean, ways we symbolize carrying burdens.
Ooh, good question. What comes to mind for you?
I'm going to think about that one.
Me too. But for now, let's talk about the Urim and Thummim, the divination tools.
Those were pretty mysterious.
They were, weren't they? Basically, sacred lots used to figure out God's will, kept right there in the breastplate, close to the heart.
But our source says they vanished sometime after King David. Ezra even talks about how much they missed them. What happened?
That's a great question, and honestly, nobody knows for sure.
Oh, come on.
I'm serious. Some people think they got lost when the first temple was destroyed. But there's another interesting angle here. Their absence could also symbolize a shift in how divine guidance was understood. In the New Testament, the Holy Spirit takes center stage. It's like maybe those physical objects weren't needed anymore once the internal presence of the Holy Spirit became so important.
So from external tools to an internal guide, that's a big shift.
A huge shift. And speaking of shifts, let's talk about those bells.
Oh yeah, the robe with the bells along the hem. The source mentions the bells were supposed to be heard when the high priest entered and left the sanctuary. Why all the jingle jangle?
Okay, so there are a few theories here. Some people think the bells represented thunder and lightning, connecting the high priest to God's power.
Right.
Others think it was more practical, like a way for worshipers to know where the high priest was in the tabernacle, kind of a sacred sound system.
I love that. A sacred sound system.
Yeah.
But what else?
Well, maybe the bells were like a warning. Remember, no one could be in the tabernacle when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Hearing those bells, that was your cue to get out, fast, divine wrath and all that.
So bells as a life-saving fashion statement. I love it. See, it really is all about the detail.
It really is.
Okay, last but not least, the mitre. And that golden headplate. What was up with that?
Well, the mitre was like a fancy turban, signifying authority. But that headplate, that was the real deal, made of gold, inscribed with Holy to YHWH.
Wow. Heavy stuff. What did it symbolize?
It showed the high priest was consecrated, set apart. He was there to atone for the people's mistakes, unintentional ones, of course. He was representing them before God.
Makes you wonder about the power of hats, right? Across different cultures,
Yeah.
what they represent.
Oh, yeah, totally. But for now, we've got to move on to the other priests.
Right. What did they get to wear?
Well, they didn't get all the bling, but their outfits were still meaningful. Tunics, waistbands, headdresses, linen breeches, all about modesty and purity.
So no gold or jewels for them.
Nope, not quite. But covering up was symbolic, too. Remember Adam and Eve? Physical nakedness and spiritual vulnerability, it's all connected. By covering themselves, the priests acknowledged their human limitations, their need for God.
It was like a physical representation of humility and reverence, putting on the right attitude before entering God's presence.
Exactly. And that theme, approaching the divine with humility, it's woven through the entire design of the sanctuary and the priestly vestments.
So we've learned a lot today. It's incredible how much meaning is packed into every detail.
It's like a giant puzzle. And the more we dig, the more we discover, the more connections we find.
So what have we learned so far? It seems that every single detail mattered. From the materials to the symbols, it was all carefully chosen to communicate these deep spiritual truths.
It's like a divine blueprint. And as we go forward, we'll uncover even more layers of meaning. We'll explore how these ancient practices connect to our lives today.
It's wild, right? Like we've been talking about this structure, the sanctuary, but it wasn't just a building. It was like this total sensory experience.
I know, it's so hard to imagine what it was actually like to be there.
Right. But try. Close your eyes and picture it. The sights, the sounds, the smells,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Good. Those flickering lamps, the scent of incense wafting through the air, people murmuring prayers, the swish, swish, swish of those priestly robes.
Wow, you're really painting a picture here.
It was like a symphony of sensations.
Yeah.
Purposefully designed, all to draw people in, to help them connect with God.
It's like you said before, a kind of spiritual theater.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the goal was the same as any good play, to transport the audience, lift them out of the ordinary into something sacred.
And for the Israelites, fresh out of slavery in Egypt.
Oh, man, can you imagine?
It's hard to even fathom. I know. To go from that, from harsh labor and all that oppression to this elaborate structure. God's portable palace, right there in the middle of nowhere.
Wow, yeah. It would have been a powerful symbol of God's protection, his presence.
Absolutely. Like, hey, I'm here with you, even in the wilderness, even when things are tough.
So speaking of tangible signs, let's dive into those rituals that happened in the sanctuary. We talked about the blood sacrifices a little bit, but what else went on in there?
Oh, man, so much. There were daily offerings, incense, grain, wine, all representing gratitude, dependence on God's provision, and then, of course, the feasts and festivals throughout the year, each one with its own special meaning.
So this place was buzzing. A constant hub of activity.
It was a constant reminder of that covenant relationship between God and his people. It was a place where they could come together as a community to worship, to offer those sacrifices, to celebrate, to seek guidance.
It's fascinating to me that the sanctuary was portable. Why was that so important?
Oh, man, that's key. Think about it. The Israelites were on the move, right? Wandering through the wilderness, looking for the promised land.
Right.
So God's dwelling place, it traveled with them. It was literally tabernacling among them. What a powerful image of God's presence, his constant guidance.
Yeah, like a visible symbol that he was with them every step of the way.
Exactly. And it points to something deeper too, about our own relationship with God. We don't have a physical tabernacle anymore, but God's presence, it's not limited to a specific place. He's not stuck in a building.
He goes with us.
He goes with us wherever we go.
I love that. Like it says in Psalms, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?
Exactly.
But okay, let's circle back to those sacrifices for a minute. I mean, I know we touched on this before, but they're hard to wrap your head around from a modern perspective anyway.
Yeah.
What can we learn from them today? Even though we don't do animal sacrifices anymore.
Right, right. It's a good question. But those sacrifices, they point to something really fundamental about us, about being human. We need atonement, forgiveness, reconciliation with God.
It's deep, right?
It is. For the Israelites, it was a physical act, a way to acknowledge their shortcomings, to ask for God's mercy.
So the outward form may have changed, but the need, that core human need for forgiveness,
Yeah.
it's still the same.
100%. And in the New Testament, it's Jesus who becomes the ultimate sacrifice, the one who atones for everyone.
Right. So it all connects. The Old Testament sacrifices, they were like a foreshadowing of what was to come.
Exactly. And even though we don't offer animals anymore, we can still offer sacrifices, sacrifices of praise, of service, of humility, a contrite heart.
It's not about the outward show, but the inward posture. A willingness to surrender to God, to seek his forgiveness.
You got it.
Okay, so we've talked about those sacrifices.
Yeah.
About the fact that the sanctuary was portable, about that whole multisensory experience of being there. What's the big takeaway here? How can people listening apply this to their lives today?
Well, I think the most important thing is this. God wants to dwell among us. He wants to be present in our lives, even when we're wandering, even when things are messy.
He's with us in the wilderness.
He's with us in the wilderness. And he invites us to create those spaces, physical and spiritual spaces, where we can connect with him, experience his love, his grace, his guidance.
I love that. It's not about trying to recreate those ancient rituals exactly, but about finding ways to cultivate that same sense of awe, reverence, connection with God.
Yes, 100%.
This has been so insightful. We've been unpacking the deeper meanings behind the sanctuary, all the rituals, but I'm curious, what about the people who couldn't even enter?
Oh, right. Mim.
Yeah, who were they, and how did they experience this whole thing?
Well, you got to remember, not everyone had equal access. It wasn't like that. Women, for example, they were restricted to the outer courtyard. And some people, those with disabilities or certain ritual impurities, they weren't allowed in at all.
So even in this system designed to bring people closer to God, there were still barriers.
There were. And it's definitely something to think about. It raises some questions about inclusivity, how different groups within a society experience the divine.
It makes you wonder, are we doing the same thing today, even unintentionally? Are we creating barriers in our own spiritual communities, excluding people without even realizing it?
It's a question worth asking, for sure. How can we make sure our spaces, our practices are truly welcoming, accessible to anyone who's seeking God?
That's a powerful challenge. And I think it really resonates with the core of the gospel, that radical inclusivity, love for all people. Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. As we head into the final part of our deep dive, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the lasting legacy of the sanctuary. What can we learn from this ancient structure? And what can we take away from it that still resonates with us today? How can we bridge the gap between these ancient practices and our own search for meaning, our desire to connect with God? We've been talking about the sanctuary as this physical space, this place where the Israelites could actually go to encounter God. But what happened to that? That visible, tangible presence.
It's really interesting how the story of the sanctuary unfolds. Like, it starts out as this portable structure. It's a symbol of God's presence. It's traveling with them through the wilderness.
Right.
And then under King Solomon, it becomes this magnificent permanent temple in Jerusalem.
So it goes from tent in the desert to this grand temple.
Yeah.
That's quite a change.
It is. It really reflects how the Israelites' understanding of their relationship with God was changing. As they went from nomads to a settled people in the Promised Land, their sense of God's presence also changed. It became more fixed, more tied to a specific place.
But even these grand temples, I mean,
Yeah.
they don't last forever, right?
Unfortunately not. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians back in 586 BC.
Oh, wow.
It was devastating, a real turning point. It made people question everything, God's presence, his covenant.
So what happened after the temple was destroyed? Did they rebuild it?
They did. After they returned from exile in Babylon, they built the Second Temple.
Okay.
It stood for centuries, until the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD. But even though they rebuilt the physical structure, something was different. The Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark.
It was gone, never recovered after the first temple was destroyed.
Wow. So the heart of the sanctuary, that tangible symbol of God's presence, was just gone. What did that do to the Jewish faith?
It caused a huge shift in practice, in understanding. The focus went from temple sacrifices and rituals to prayer, to study, to acts of loving kindness. Synagogues, they became the places where people gathered. They kind of took the place of the temple.
So it was like this decentralization of their faith. It wasn't about a building anymore.
Right. It became about having a relationship with God that could be lived anywhere.
That's amazing. It's like their faith became portable, like that first tabernacle.
Exactly. And this shift has had such a lasting impact. It made Judaism a faith that could survive anything. Exile, persecution, even the loss of its physical center.
It's a powerful reminder that our connection to God, it doesn't depend on outward things. It's about what's in our hearts. This has been so fascinating. We've gone from these super specific details of the sanctuary all the way to these big theological shifts.
It has been quite a journey.
It really has. So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can hold on to?
Well, I think one of the big ones is the power of symbolism. Every single thing in the sanctuary, the materials, the layout, it was all chosen to teach us something.
It's like learning a whole new language.
Right, the language of the sacred. It teaches us to look for the spiritual meaning in the things we see around us. And then the story of the sanctuary also reminds us that we need to create spaces, physical and spiritual spaces, where we can encounter God.
Like setting aside time for prayer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or finding a quiet place in nature, or even just creating a little corner in your home where you can connect with God.
It's about making room for the sacred, giving ourselves permission to step out of the everyday and into something bigger.
I love that. And then lastly, the way the Jewish faith evolved after the temple was destroyed, it teaches us that our relationship with God, it's not about buildings or rituals, it's about cultivating that inner connection.
So it's more about inward change than outward forms.
Yes, exactly. It's about building a faith that can survive anything, a faith that isn't shaken when things fall apart, because it's rooted in something deeper, in God's love, his faithfulness.
This has been an incredible journey through the Old Testament sanctuary. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I know I've learned a lot.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, everyone, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep learning, keep searching. There's so much more to discover.
And on that note, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.